Counselor Kylie, I want to go down to the lake.
Oh, you want to go swimming? Okay, yeah, go, have fun. I literally could not care less. Oh, hi, Mrs. Voorhees. How's Jason doing? Is that an axe? Why do you have... Oh my gosh, oh my god. Oh my god. Okay, you let one kid drown in a lake and suddenly his mom wants to kill you with an axe. All right. You know what? Her son was getting in the way of my indulgence time. I came here just to chill out. So you know what? Mrs. Voorhees, you can go ahead and kiss my ass. Little inside jokes if you're familiar with the original Friday the 13th. I was just doing my best to be on brand for today's video, in which we'll be comparing the original Friday the 13th from 1980 to Friday the 13th from 2009. This one was highly requested, but don't worry if you voted for one of the other movies because all those videos will also be coming soon. I'm also toying with the idea of doing a Pet Sematary comparison video, so let me know if you fancy that. But if you're new here, for the structure of today's video, first I'm gonna tackle all of the relevant historical background information, some behind the scenes stuff, etc. Then we'll dive into the plots of either movie and compare and contrast them. Next, we'll compare all of the major characters of each of the movies, maybe some noteworthy side characters. Of course, we'll talk about our final girls and our villains. After that, I'll talk about the styles of either of the movies, and this can include a really wide range of topics, so like production design, the dialogue, but today I'm really gonna try to focus on the kills. And then the last topic of today will be covering all of the themes in either of the movies. You know, what moral lessons are we meant to be learning? And finally, in the end, we'll do one big overall comparison for me to try to decide which I think is the superior film. If you're only interested in one of these topics, then hopefully timestamps will be linked down below. I try to do that for all of these videos. But without further ado, I say that we dive into Friday the 13th from 1980. Before we get into the information, I just want to cite my sources in case you feel like fact-checking me or you want to watch any of these things for yourself. There's a nearly 7-hour-long documentary on Amazon Prime / Shudder, and it's called Camp Crystal Lake Memories. Full transparency, I only watched the first hour and the last hour of this documentary so that I could get all the information just on the first movie and the reboot. And there are a few videos on YouTube that have some featurettes on the reboot, remake, whatever you want to call it. And finally, I rewatched the original movie with the director's commentary on top of it. And there were a few other people giving commentary, like screenwriter Victor Miller, Adrian King, Betsy Palmer joined in, and then I think the guy that did the score and possibly Tom Savini was also on the commentary. So that's where all of my info is coming from today. So Friday the 13th, it came out in 1980 and was directed by Sean Cunningham. It had a budget of $550,000 and went on to gross $59.8 million. Back in 1979, Sean Cunningham was wondering how he could support his family, and so he decided to be one of the directors in the 80s to do a really low budget film in the hopes of breaking into the industry on a bigger scale. He even said on the director's commentary that the most important thing that you should try to do when you're a young director is make money so that you can go on to direct more projects. Kind of refreshing to have somebody be so realistic instead of those film bros that are like, money is just an object. Film should be about the art because the integrity of one's art cannot be bought. Like, okay, Tyler, I wish that I could afford to be that delusional, but some of us have to cater to a broader audience before we are afforded that kind of creative license. Sorry, as a recent film school graduate, it's mandatory that I complain about these things. So anyways, after seeing Halloween, Sean Cunningham then contacted Victor Miller and more or less said to him, hey, this thing is doing really well, let's rip it off. Believe me, I watched several interviews with Victor Miller and Sean Cunningham, and they said very explicitly that they were in fact ripping Halloween off, okay? I'm not trying to talk shit or anything. So then Victor Miller went ahead and he watched Halloween and he did his best to copy Halloween's structure. But prior to that, when they were just trying to get funding for this project, they didn't even have a script yet. All they had in their arsenal was the image of Friday the 13th bursting through the glass, and they had the tagline, scariest movie ever made. Of course, they did end up getting their funding, and then when it came time to casting their final girl, they had to choose out of a pool of about 1,000 girls. And without any acting experience, without being a part of any kind of acting union or anything, they chose Adrian King. Betsy Palmer was then cast as the iconic villain in this movie, much to the chagrin of a lot of her older fans who were just appalled that she would participate in such B-movie schlock. And she almost didn't do it because she wasn't interested in being in a horror film. She initially said no to her agent. And in a 2008 panel, when some of the cast and crew got back together to be interviewed, she admitted verbatim that she thought that the script was, quote, a piece of shit. And then maybe I wasn't paying well enough attention, but I couldn't really piece together exactly why she ended up saying yes to the project. She did mention though that she only had to shoot for 10 days and she was offered $1,000 a day, so I guess, that's probably why. Some other notable names that they got on this project would be Tom Savini, and he was hired for the work that he did in, I believe, Dawn of the Dead. This was also Kevin Bacon's second big-time screen role, the first being Animal House. But on with some of the information about the production itself. Even though this is a summertime movie, they shot it during the cold season. It was filmed at Camp Nobibosco. It was a Boy Scout camp in Hardwick, New Jersey. And New Jersey gets cold. In fact, sometimes they couldn't even shoot outside because it was snowing, so they had to schedule their shoot around the snow. And mind you, there are several scenes of the counselors out swimming, they're hanging out in swimsuits, and it was cold. In my opinion, that doesn't really read at all on screen. I fully buy that it's summertime, and my theory on this is that everybody was having a really good time on set. Everyone seems to remember the experience very fondly and had a really good time working with each other. You love that considering some of the awful stories that you hear about working on classic horror film sets. On the channel Possessed by Horror, Sarah Hawkinson is doing a really great series on this right now. So far she's covered the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and just recently The Shining. But Friday the 13th was a very lovely experience for everybody involved, which you love to hear. Now when it comes to the reception of this movie after its release, this is a whole mixed bag of fun. The critical reception was pretty terrible because critics were saying that this movie was all about spectacle and it took all the emphasis off of, story and acting. But people are just hypercritical of horror movies for some reason. Historically, that's just always been true. But movies of spectacle already existed. You have a movie like 10 Commandments, which is also just about all the crazy special effects and stuff. Friday the 13th was doing the same thing, but the spectacle was just the gore. And it wasn't even overkill like the critics were claiming it to be, because when it came time to trim this movie down to make the TV version, they only had to cut out about 20 seconds of gore. But the critics overreacting only made the teenagers want to go see it more. They believe that they actually got the most business from the teenagers who went to see the movie multiple times. They'd be like, oh my god, that movie was crazy, next time I'm gonna bring my boyfriend, next time I'll bring my friends, then I'm gonna bring my cousins. You don't really have people doing that as much anymore because of the accessibility to movies. So part of the success was due to the fact that this was before VHS, DVD, rental stores, stuff like that, and it was also before horror movies were being produced on a major scale by major studios. If you wanted to be titillated, shall we say, then you pretty much had to go to the theater. So naturally, Friday the 13th had a lot of repeat business. Another thing that Friday the 13th did for the industry is it made makeup artists a lot more central to the conversation. This film catapulted Tom Savini's career, and because of this, he got interviewed, he got to go on talk shows, he probably got hired for like all of your favorite 80s horror movies, and suddenly people in the community were asking, well, who's doing the special effects on this movie? So Friday the 13th went on to change the genre and the industry in so many different ways. It inspired a bunch of teen-based horror that were based around holidays in the following years, but then, not only that, it also inspired what is now a 12-film franchise, but also probably has countless fan-made films, the best of which, in my opinion, being Never Hike Alone. This movie is positively fantastic, by the way, and it has a very special guest star from the original franchise. But anyways, on that note, after 10 sequels, they finally decided to reboot the franchise and make the brand new Friday the 13th from 2009. The people that worked on this movie themselves don't even really know how to define it. It's really however you want to view it. A lot of people claim it to be a remake of the first 4 films, some people just call it a remake, and some people call it a reboot. I think that I fall in with the reboot people. They do borrow a lot from the original 4 movies, but this is definitely its own new thing. And it had a budget of a whopping $19 million and then went on to make $92.8 million. Like all other major early 2000s slasher remakes, Michael Bay was a producer. Also, interestingly, Marcus Nispel was the director. He had also worked with Michael Bay to direct the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre that came out in 2003. And you can definitely tell a lot about the styles are very similar. I think that Nispel has his own vibe, if you will. Anyways, the writers Damien Shannon and Mark Swift said that they wanted this installment to be a lot more serious and less goofy than the rest of the franchise. They also admitted that they did take a lot of elements from the first 4 films. They were really big fans of the franchise, so obviously they wanted to acknowledge the story that already existed. Speaking of the fans, people loved Jason in this movie. He's played by the fan favorite Derek Mears. Something that I thought was really interesting is that Derek Mears suffers from alopecia, and so while growing up he was losing his hair and he felt very different to the kids around him. For this reason, when Derek Mears was a kid, he felt like he really related to Jason because he also felt like an outcast, and he also said that it was one of the greatest honors of his life to be able to play him. And he said that he would return for a sequel if there would be one, but if you're a fan of the Friday the 13th franchise, then woo, you know that's probably not happening anytime soon. I think that they just settled the lawsuit, so I'm not sure if anybody is rushing to make another Friday the 13th movie anytime soon. But during production, everybody had a great time yet again, specifically because of Derek Mears. Everybody said that he was one of the nicest people that they ever met. A lot of the cast also loved shooting their death scenes. They had a lot of fun while they were working, and it seems like the general vibes on set were really good. Now, as for the reception of the movie, the vibes were not so good. Of course, with the critical reception, there is a lot about this movie that you could consider it to be a bad movie, but we don't really expect a good critical reception with a lot of horror movies in general. But unfortunately, the audience reception wasn't great at the time either. This happens with basically any remake. A lot of fans of the original movie or franchise will hate it for some reason or another. But the word of mouth was so bad back then that by the second weekend of this movie's release, the box office numbers dropped by 80%. But now this movie definitely has more of a cult following. There is a lot about this movie that horror fans do appreciate. I myself enjoy the movie a lot. It's my friend Tiago's favorite horror movie of all time. I think you could argue that this movie definitely pulled in a lot of new fans that are, you know, around my age to the classic franchise. And a lot of people attest that if this movie just had a few tweaks, it could easily be their favorite of the whole franchise. So that's currently where the world is at with Friday the 13th. We don't know when we'll ever get another sequel, but I highly recommend checking out Vincente DeSantis' fan-made films. Never Hike Alone, Never Hike in the Snow, and Jason Rising. They're all really, really impressive films. So if you're starved for some new Friday the 13th content and you haven't heard of that, then please check them out. But with all of that info out of the way, I think it's time that we dive into the plots of these movies. Crystal Lake's history of murders doesn't stop camp from reopening in the summer of 1980. A group of randy young adults make their way up to the camp only to be stalked and picked off one by one by a brutal killer. I'm just gonna be honest with you, I'm gonna struggle a little bit with this portion of the video. There's not much of a plot to this movie besides with our lovely villain. It doesn't feel disjointed by any means. I mean, I think that the pacing is fine, but there's not really any story to it. It's literally just a bunch of teenagers slash young adults who are just vibing at camp, and then they get picked off one by one. And that's fine. They were totally aware of the movie that they were making. I don't think that they were trying to make it very plot rich, but it just doesn't really make for much interesting conversation with this portion of the video. It does feel real though, at least, like with all of the scenes of them just hanging out by the fire, they're playing Monopoly, they're getting laid, smoking weed. It just makes the movie drag a little bit because there's not enough story to fill that space. I'll talk about the story and the motivations of Mrs. Voorhees when we get to our character comparison though, don't worry. Something plot-wise though that is pretty iconic for this movie is the very final jump scare with Jason jumping out of the water to Alice. Sean Cunningham actually doesn't think that his film would be as successful if it didn't have that final jump scare. Apparently in the theaters, a lot of people started to leave as soon as they thought that the movie was over when Alice was just safe in her little canoe. But the reactions of people being scared when Jason jumped up out of the water had people running back into the theaters. That's just what they said. I was not alive for another 20 years, so I can't really attest to that. When I just rewatched the movie though, I was like, this dream sequence is really reminiscent of Carrie. And sure enough, Tom Savini did confirm my suspicions that they also tried to rip off Carrie with the ending. Apparently the original ending was just going to be Mrs. Voorhees getting beheaded, but they wanted to do something that was a bit more shocking, and Tom Savini had just seen Carrie and he was like, well, what if Jason popped up? And the other people on the film were like, I don't know about that, like Jason's definitely dead. And Tom Savini, who had just seen Carrie, was like, well, if you make it a dream, then you can get away with anything. And speaking of ripping other movies off, we already know that they were trying to copy the formula of Halloween. And another movie that they intentionally copied was Psycho. You have the character of Annie, who maybe you would assume is the main character because we follow her on the way to the camp, but about a third of the way through the movie, she is killed, much like our lovely Marion Crane. It's just kind of interesting to me that a movie that was intentionally very unoriginal in a lot of ways went on to do what it did. But that pretty much covers all of the important points of the original plot, so let's move on to the remake. Now, the plot is where I think that the remake shined a little bit more, because on top of having amazing kills, there was a bit of a plot to follow as well. Rather than a bunch of teens that were just vibing, you also had this kid Clay who, against the advice of locals and police, scours the eerie woods surrounding Crystal Lake for his missing sister. But the rotting cabins of an abandoned summer camp are not the only thing that he finds, because hockey-masked killer Jason Voorhees lies in wait for a chance to use his razor-sharp machete on Clay and the group of college students who have come to the forest to party. So there's an added element to these protagonists that I think humanizes them a little bit, because their motivations go beyond just having sex, drinking, smoking, all of that. Beyond that, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot more to the plot that we can get into, because what we do have to cover, I'll be talking about later on. So we are very quickly moving on to our character comparison of this video. We don't have too many characters to get into in the original, because a lot of them are just very, very flat one-note side characters. First of all, I want to talk about Crazy Ralph, because there's nothing like him in the reboot, and I think that he is the most noteworthy side character. Although he's not really a character at all, he's more of a spooky element, like the human embodiment of a warning sign. I just laugh every single time that he's on screen, because sometimes he is so clearly used just to pad out the runtime. Like when he comes up to the camp to warn the counselors, and then the shot lingers for like 30 seconds on him just riding his bike away from them. Lots of little awkward pacing gaps are just part of the fun of B-movie schlock. But obviously we also need to talk about our final girl, Alice. I don't love her, but she's not a bad final girl. Also, with the general reception of this movie, a lot of women felt empowered by Alice. Adrienne King herself also feels very empowered to have played the character. The critical reception of that, again, is a whole other thing, but we'll actually cover that during the theme portion of this video. But to share my opinion, she's not one of my favorite final girls, because I just feel like her fight is kind of weak. When you hold her up to the Ripleys and the Sarah Connors and the Gail Weatherses of final girls, I just feel like she doesn't really hold a candlestick to them. And mind you, she is fighting a small older woman, and the best she can do is throw some stuff, hit her definitely not hard enough, and then run and hide. And then repeat the process like 4 times, because each time she hits her, she's barely making a dent. It's very frustrating to me. Like, I know that this is not supposed to be funny, but it makes me crack up every single time, just the way that she hits her. I mean, The beheading is badass, I will give you that, but in all other regards, I'm just less than impressed with Alice. In the remake, we have 2 final people, which we love to see them shaking it up a bit. Jared Padalecki plays the brooding brother of the lost sister, who is played by Amanda Righetti. And then we have the lovely Danielle Panabaker, who everybody thought would be the final girl. This was a lovely shock that the movie threw me, because she followed all of the rules of slashers and she was really sensible, but she still didn't make it. Side note, I've been a huge fan of her since Sky High, which is a perfect movie, by the way. But in this reboot, none of the leads are particularly interesting, honestly. The most interesting one to me is probably the frat boy homeowner, and that's literally just because you become really invested in hating him. It does make his death feel very rewarding though, so I'm really glad that they waited so long to kill him. Okay, I just looked this man up so that I could get a picture of him for this video, and I just found out that his name is Travis Van Winkle. What a name! Oh my god, and I just realized he's the actor from season 3 of You. That just blew my mind. And my favorite moment with him is his scream, because honestly, I think that that scream is better than almost any of his female counterparts in the entire franchise. But none of the protagonists were written with too much depth, so now we're gonna move on to our villains. In the original, of course, we have Pamela Voorhees, and I think she is such an interesting villain because of the amount of people that sympathize with her. And something that I feel like a lot of people probably don't know is that Betsy Palmer came up with the whole character treatment by herself. In Betsy Palmer's mind, Pamela Voorhees had gotten pregnant as a teenager, and then her parents pretty much disowned her. So then she had to make it on her own, and eventually she found Camp Crystal Lake where she could be a cook, and this worked out really well for her because while she was working, little Jason could run around and he would be perfectly safe and cared for because there were all these counselors that could watch him. And then after all of this hardship, being kicked out and then finally finding her way, the counselors neglected her son to the point where he drowned and died. Also, there's weirdly a lot of debate to whether or not Jason actually was dead in the original, I think because of that final jump scare. But Betsy Palmer herself upholds that Pamela wouldn't have done any of what she did if Jason wasn't actually dead. And also that final jump scare is a part of a dream sequence. So she was a highly motivated killer, and the same can actually be said for the reboot. In the reboot, of course, we have Jason doing the killing, but it's for a very different motivation. He's a very deformed and ostracized person in society, and he lost the one person that cared about him at a very young age. He witnessed her actually being killed by a counselor, and society had pushed him into this little corner of the world where he's living off of the land of Crystal Lake. It's really the only place that he can call his own, so then when society comes bumbling through his land, he retaliates. I think it's a really interesting element that they added to this movie that he witnessed his mom die. And before she did, she made it very, very clear that she blamed counselors having sex as the reason why her son was neglected. And then that inspired her killing spree, which is something that Jason at a very young age absorbed. So then into adulthood, he carried this belief that sex was an offense that was punishable by death. So it remained very true to the Jason character that had been shaped in the past 20 years before this movie, while also giving Jason a bit more complexity and a more clear motivation. And it also gave reason, of course, to having all of the sex scenes in the movie. I think it's really interesting that in both the original and the remake, you have a killer who's highly motivated instead of being just a single note like you usually see Jason as. He's someone that you can kind of sympathize with because he has been ostracized and not properly socialized. Plus his mom was just absolutely batshit. I don't think that people sympathize with Jason as much though as Betsy Palmer because the stories that this woman has, she said that people sympathize with her so much to the point where whenever she does panels and whatever meet and greets and stuff like that, people will actually put their babies in her arms. And it's because they all sympathize with her so much as mothers themselves. I think that that's crazy because it's also so ironic because with all of the young adults and teenagers that she's killing, those are someone's children too. So I'm not a mother. It's a little bit above my head why mothers can sympathize with her so much, but alas. She's a good villain. I like that she's really complex and has a really believable motivation. And I think that the reboot Jason is my favorite Jason for that same reason. They also changed him up a lot by giving him the ability to set traps, to hunt, to run. It gives him more of a human energy, which I'm actually fond of. When they do that to Michael, I'm not a fan, but with Jason, I actually think that it makes him more interesting. But I think that does it for our villain comparison, so I'm gonna move on to the styles of each movie. Honestly, there isn't too much style to either of these movies unless we're talking about the kills. Briefly, I will say that the original does have that low budget kind of 80s feel to it. It's shot on film, so the movie definitely shows its age, but usually in a good way. They had a really low production budget though, so they had to shoot a lot of it in quite a bit of a rush, so there really isn't much of an emphasis on style, unless there is some blood on screen, and the gore effects of this movie I think are pretty fantastic. Some of the deaths aren't even on camera, they're just used to build suspense, like for example the reveal of the slit throat on the bunk bed. And then later in the very same scene, you have a very gruesome spear coming through Kevin Bacon's throat. Something that Sean Cunningham said that really stuck with me is that old school practical effects are like capturing a magic trick on camera. It left people thinking, how did they do that? But then after that, Cunningham said that with today's technology, any gifted film student can go and make really great computer generated effects. Or pretty much anybody with an interest in video making can just go do that now. And Friday the 13th was really one of the first of its kind to show the gore on screen. You had some exploitation cinema in the 60s and 70s, but in terms of gore and like mainstream cinema, there was nothing else like Friday the 13th. And luckily, this practicality was something that was more or less maintained in the reboot. For example, for Richie's death, his leg was fake and practical, as well as his face makeup and the machete that was in his face. The only slight catch is that the part of the machete that actually went into his face was added digitally later. So most of the kills do stay true to practical effects, and then some minimal CGI was added later, which is what I prefer because I think that it does enhance it, and it's almost never noticeable. And another example of this would be Trent's death. For this death, they had this huge mechanical harness that would simulate the effect of the machete going through his body, and then he was really being picked up by Derek Mears. That's a level of dedication you simply must appreciate. And in general, the kills in the remake are just epic. They really do showcase Derek Mears' strength and his agility as Jason. As I mentioned, we also get to see him running, and he's slinging arrows, and he's hacking axes through the air. I can't decide if I like the axe death or Trent's death more. Do you have a preference? Let me know your favorite kill. But moving on, with the cinematography, I don't feel like there's anything that's like super noticeable about it. The cinematography is really good in a subtle way, except for, oh yeah, they love to objectify women. Listen, I generally would not have a problem with this because I'll be the first to admit I can definitely appreciate a woman's form. However, men ruin everything. Before I get into why, I just want to say that the nudity in the original is something that I actually commend it for, because it was never shot through the male gaze. It was just shot as a very impartial third-party viewer kind of, and not like a literal softcore porno like the remake or reboot, whatever you want to call it. I'm about to get scientific with this, and I know that misogynists have a pea-sized brain, so they're already gone. Or, well, let's be honest, they were never here. But for those of you with more than one brain cell, just please bear with me for a second. People much smarter than me have attempted to explain why this kind of visualization of women is a bad thing. Number one, when women view other women being objectified in this way, it can lead to insecurities resulting in disordered eating, self-image anxiety, and possibly depression. And number two, they've actually done studies on the brain about what is stimulated when women are objectified. Men and women too will stop viewing a woman as a whole person with emotions and feelings when they're depicted in this way, which contributes to gender violence and culture. I don't want to get into the specifics mainly because they're probably up on screen right now, and also I'm not a psychologist, so I'm really not the one to speak on this. If you want to read the scientific peer-reviewed articles that I studied, they will be linked down below. So anyways, in a scene that's very guilty of this, there is some dialogue that I want to touch on.
Your tits are stupendous.
To be honest, I haven't a clue if this was meant to be comedic or if these writers actually think that that's what you should say to a woman during sex, but either way, I kind of have to thank the writers for giving me material that I can just point and laugh at, because either way it's like, oh haha, Trent is such an idiot, like he actually thinks this is what women want to hear, or it's like, haha, these writers probably never get laid. I actually do enjoy a lot of the dialogue in this movie. I think that some of it is really funny and a lot of it is pretty lowbrow, but like not low enough to the point where I feel above laughing at it. But that kind of does it for everything that I want to touch on with the styles of these movies. I will touch on it a bit more later when I do my overall comparison though, but for now we're going to talk about the themes of each movie. In the original, it was very much on the same note as Halloween. You put average middle-class people in an average middle-class setting, and then bad things happen to good people. It's about preying on the fear that death is totally random. A lot of feminist critics didn't like the original movie because they thought that it was trying to sell this moral fable about sex being a sin. But Sean Cunningham doesn't subscribe to this ideal at all, that like if you have sex you die. He just thinks that the movie is really about bad things happening to good people. He compared it to Jaws, how we see the people in the ocean from the shark's point of view. The shark is not looking to see who's a good person and who's a bad person. He's just looking for his lunch. And another bit of evidence that supports this is the fact that Alice smokes weed. She's clearly had sex. It happened off screen though. We just hear about it because there's dialogue between her and the head counselor. So she really wasn't any different to anybody else at the camp. She just happened to get lucky. And I think that this was so effective for audiences because teen horror wasn't very common at the time. But I think that pretty much every teenager subscribes to the notion that bad things happen to other people, not me. They don't feel the sense of their own mortality or the randomness of death, and I think that the original Friday the 13th definitely forced them to confront this. Beyond that, there aren't really any glaring themes other than, you know, if you're a camp counselor, do your job. And then in the remake, I think that it kind of follows the same vein about the randomness of death. I honestly don't think that you could really read into it much deeper than that. And I know that I went on a long-winded rant about the objectification of women, but I don't think that any of the men working on this movie were doing it consciously. What I mean to say is I don't think that they were sitting behind the camera like, yes, let's give young women eating disorders. It's just literally the society that we live in that's completely normalized this behavior from men to objectify women, so I wouldn't even say that there are like sexist undertones to the movie or anything, so I don't believe that to contribute anything to the theme of the movie. And all of that to say, it's time for our final comparison to decide which is the superior film. My favorite way to compare movies now is to ask myself how I feel about them on a rewatch, because a thematically and visually plot-heavy movie will have a lot of very rich layers to unpack every time that you watch it. There will always be new details for you to pick up on. With these movies, they're a lot more about spectacle, and so we kind of have to ask ourselves how we feel about their entertainment value and how that holds up. I was not surprised to find that I felt the exact same way about the original upon my second viewing. I get very bored while watching that movie unless there's a part that's supposed to be scary, like the final showdown with Mrs. Voorhees, and then I just laugh at it. I think that what came out of that original movie when people had more resources, like for part 2, part 4, even Jason X is beautiful, and I really commend the original for allowing that to happen. However, I'm sorry, I'm just really not a fan. Similar to Carrie though, after doing my research on the behind the scenes and on the impact that this movie had on the genre, I do have a much deeper appreciation for the original. Now for the remake, I hated it the first time that I watched it because I was like, why is there a flashback and then another flashback and then 23 minutes into the movie the story actually starts? And why are the women so grotesquely sexualized? I just was not having a good time on my first viewing. This time when I could brace myself for those parts of the movie, I really enjoyed the ride. The kills are so good in the remake. I think that a lot of the dialogue actually feels pretty realistic, and I actually think that a lot of the movie is very funny as it's intended to be. And I really enjoyed it upon a second viewing, which I was not expecting at all. I still only gave it 2.5 stars though, because if we're keeping it absolutely 100, it's really, I mean, it's not a good movie, but it's a fun ride. So oddly enough, I do have to give the trophy to the remake today. The remake is the winner. Oh yes, oh yes. This has been a somewhat rare occurrence in this original versus remake series that I've been doing. So far I've covered House of Wax, I've done Carrie, I've done The Thing and 13 Ghosts, and there were a couple of others that I've done as well. And I usually can't decide which movie I like more, or the original will win by a landslide. So sound off below. Did you come to the same conclusion, or are you a diehard fan of the original? Just let me know. Let me know down below. Tell me all your secrets. And also tell me why. I love to foster a good discussion in the comment section. But that does it for today's video. As always, a big thank you to my lovely patrons. You get all your kisses. If you would like my kisses too, then my Patreon will be linked down below, and you can sign up and be credited as basically a producer of this channel for supporting me. Also, definitely follow my horror Instagram. There's a lot of good content on there. I love to talk to you guys in the comment section of my posts. You can also follow my travel account on Instagram. It's also kind of like my personal account. It features a lot of my photography. But other than that, all of my other socials will be linked down below as well. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Make sure to watch your kids in the lake, and bye! Oh my god.